Hey, what's up? It's Jesko from AcousticsInsider.com, where I teach home studio acoustic treatment techniques for audio professionals, but without all the voodoo. I'm back continuing giving you guys my education. Obviously, this is my video series in collaboration with HEDD Audio. Just quickly before we get started, if you want to watch the rest of the videos in this series, have a look at the link in the card. And if you're in the market for a new speaker and you're considering HEDD Audio, have a look at the link in the description. That is an affiliate link, but basically if you buy through that link, you'll support both me and HEDD Audio, obviously at no extra cost to you. But with that, let's get started talking about subwoofers. Second video in the series. The first one in the series was all about picking the right subwoofer. This one is about placing the subwoofer, setting it up in your home studio. So that's what I want to talk to you guys about today. Now, a quick disclaimer, I'm only going to be talking about single subwoofer setups, okay? I know a lot of you guys are interested in multi-sub setups, but that's a whole different ballgame. And for home studios, it can get pretty tricky, especially if you're not in a perfectly symmetrical room. But if you want to do some further reading, have a look at the resource section in the description. That is a website that summarizes different approaches, different concepts on implementing multi-sub setups. So if you want to do some further reading, if you want to go down that rabbit hole, have a look at that. Okay, so when we're thinking about placing a subwoofer in a typical home studio, the main thing to understand is that this is about optimizing the frequency response in the lower frequencies, right? And actually, it comes down to two different aspects. One, and I've talked about this before if you've been watching my videos, is actually optimizing your listening position first, because you want to basically locate yourself in a spot in the room where the low end gives you the best overall balance. So that's the first step to placing a subwoofer, is actually placing your listening position, because then you can place your subwoofer to drive energy into the low end, into the kind of room mode standing wave pattern in your room in a way that actually gives you that balanced response that you set out to get with placing your listening position, okay? So first up, place your listening position, and then you place your sub to also get a good low end balance. Just really important to understand here, this isn't about getting rid of the kind of peaks and nulls, the peaks and dips created by room modes. This is simply about kind of balancing them against each other until you get that overall best balance, if you will. So obviously, placing your sub to kind of drive energy into those room modes is super dependent on your actual room, the geometry of your room, and the room mode pattern that you're getting in your room. And because there are potentially tons of options, we really want to narrow those options down so we can actually get this done in a time frame that makes sense, right? And in fact, we need to narrow it down to maintain certain aspects, to maintain certain other criteria apart from the frequency response. So the first way we can narrow down our options is by understanding that the sub and the speakers basically need to sit at the same distance to your listening position, right? So obviously you've got your listening position, you've got your speakers set up, there's a certain distance from your listening position to your speakers, and you want the distance to your sub to be the same as to your speakers. And the reason is that you want the sub and the speakers, the signal from both, to arrive at your listening position both in phase and in time. The phase aspect I talked about in the last video, so in part one of this two-parter, but the time aspect is just as relevant, and that's what basically limits us to this distance that we want to keep from our listening position. So what does this actually mean, having your speakers and your sub both in phase and in time? Well, imagine if you have two sine waves that start playing at the same moment in time. Now, if you just delayed one of those sine waves, you could delay that up to the point where it is basically shifted by one whole wavelength in regard to the other sine wave. At that point, these two sine waves are back in phase, but they're no longer in time. Basically, one of these starts later or starts playing later than the other one. Okay? So that's the difference in phase and time. If you think about just the phase aspect, it's slightly more tricky to understand, to kind of imagine. But again, thinking about these two sine waves that start at the same moment in time, we could also just start playing these sine waves at different parts of their cycle, of their wavelength. They still start playing at the same time, but the point where they start along their wavelength is different. And that's a phase shift, right? So we want our speaker and our sub to be both in phase and in time. And in practice, you can just imagine this like if you're playing a kick drum, for example, through the speakers and the sub, then if they're not in phase and in time, that kick will basically be kind of stretched, if you will. It will, instead of getting just a proper clean thump, you're going to get a kind of a thump, right? So that's the difference that we're looking for. We want them to be in phase and in time so that the signals start playing at the same time or arrive at the listening position at the same time, and they're also in phase. And bringing that back to the real world, that means that we want to keep that same distance from our speakers also to our sub. And basically, in terms of positioning options, that means that we want to start positioning the sub on a kind of circle around our listening position that has the same radius or the same distance as is the distance to our speakers. But we can actually narrow down our placement options even further beyond that. And the simple reason is that, yes, you can locate a subwoofer if it's positioned off to the side. This is down to psychoacoustics. In particular, it's down to the equal loudness contours. I'm not going to get into massive detail about that right now. I'll leave a link to an article by Merlin van Veen down in the resource section. Merlin is really a great educator, a sound system designer, and he goes into detail about subwoofer satellite setups like no one else I know. So if you want to understand why we can locate subwoofers when they are positioned off the center line, then check out that link. But the point is, we really want to place our sub on the center line between our speakers so it is in line with the phantom center that gets created in our stereo image. So after all that babble, when it comes down to it, to answer that original question, where should you place your sub? Well, you should start with a position that is centered between your speakers, that has the same distance to your listening position as the distance between your listening position and your speakers. That is the starting point. But there's an if, and that is if the frequency response is also best with the sub at that position. If the frequency response doesn't turn out to be that great, which is often the case, especially in only partially treated studios, then you want to start moving the sub to the side on that imaginary circle around your listening position until you find a spot where the frequency response in the low end does seem the most balanced. And yes, this is a compromise in terms of localization, right? This is a pick your poison situation, as Merlin van Veen says all the time, right? We're prioritizing certain aspects, but if we can't get those, we need to compromise on other things in order to get what we want. Yeah? So we're prioritizing frequency response, and localization is simply not as important. So if we can't get both, we're going to compromise on localization by moving the sub to the side in order to hopefully still get a good frequency response. Now, in practice, unfortunately, this is quite hard to do without using acoustic measurements, or rather just using your ears. But I still recommend that you if you don't have an option to use measurements or you're just not feeling confident enough to use measurements, check your manufacturer's websites. A lot of speaker manufacturers have sometimes pretty elaborate procedures and even kind of test files that you can use to place and set the subs correctly. So check that first, check your speaker manuals or check your sub manuals, check the websites of the manufacturers to see if they have any special procedures that you can follow to set up their subs. Oftentimes these work remarkably well, okay? If you don't even have that, there's still one last thing to try, and this is the sub listening position flip procedure. Just going to call it that. Basically what you do is that you flip the position of the sub and the listening position. So you take the sub and you actually put it on, I don't know, boxes, if you will, a kind of a bar stool or something. So it sits at your listening position at the right height, and then you have to unfortunately crawl around the floor, again on that imaginary circle, that same distance around your listening position. But you basically play some music and then you check all the available options that you have just with music to see how it sounds. And surprisingly, this works pretty well, that if you find a spot on the floor where the low end sounds pretty even, then if you now flip things back, so you basically put the sub in that spot, then you'll actually get a frequency response that is pretty good. Yeah? I've done this quite a few times. Sometimes if things are just too chaotic, this is just your last option. And I've had some luck with this, so if nothing else, then try that as well. So with all that said, let's see what that procedure would look like in this room, right? So I'm just going to go through the process of setting up this sub and showing you what those different options look like in this particular room. I'm going to start with the sub on the center line, measure the frequency response, and then we're going to move it off to the side to see what actually happens, and then simply make a decision to say, okay, this would be the best spot. Okay, so you just saw me place the sub on that little trolley that just allows me to move it more easily once I go through the testing procedure. But in terms of hooking it up, this is again kind of the most vanilla setup you can get. Just like in the first video, I've got the interface feeding the sub, and the sub then feeds the speakers. I've got the sub filter set up in the speakers that basically compensates for what the sub is doing as for the crossover network, but that's basically it. So what I'm going to show you now is I'm just going to measure the entire system with the microphone here at the listening position, starting with the sub in that center position at the same distance to the microphone as the speakers, and then I'm going to try a few different spots around that imaginary circle, as I explained, and then we'll see what actually happens to the frequency response. So let's do that now. All right, so we've got 4 measurements to look at here, starting with the centered position. So that's this one here. So as you can see, if I smooth this really, really heavily, so 1/3, maybe even just full octave smoothing, you can see that this is basically the balanced version of the frequency response. But if I give more detail, we can also see that we are not getting rid of any of the peaks and nulls, right? This is about balancing them against each other to get an overall response that is as even as possible. So let's look at the other positions in comparison and see what happens, starting with a slight shift to the left. So this is now with the subwoofer underneath the speaker, but on the inside. And that's sub L1 here. And we can see there's hardly any difference. Yeah, so in this room, that slight shift of maybe 2 feet, maybe 2 feet, about 60 centimeters, hardly has any impact at all. So any of these would be possible. Any of these two positions would be totally fine in this particular room. Obviously, we pick the center position because that gives us a localization that is in line with the phantom center, as I mentioned. But let's continue on and see what happens further to the side. So then I moved the sub underneath the speaker, but on the outside. So that's L2 here. And so now we can see that we're seeing a sort of a slight dip up here in the higher frequency region. So this is 103 Hertz. This is above the crossover frequency, right? So the sub isn't actually doing that much anymore at this frequency, but it's still doing enough to give us this kind of worse response, if you will, yeah, this slightly more accentuated dip. But still, this isn't all that bad, or it's not that much worse than our center position. So just to show you guys what would happen if I picked an even worse position or just another different position, I moved over to the far side on the left here, where it's still roughly the same distance to the listening position, but obviously way over to the side. Localization will be completely off in this position, but I just wanted to show you that obviously the impact on the frequency response is much, much greater at this point. Yeah? So now we can see that this kind of dip at around 100 Hertz is much larger. We can also see that the standing waves at 50 Hertz and 30 Hertz are not nearly as much accentuated or not as even with the room mode at 43 Hertz as it was with the sub in the center position. Okay, still these all look relatively similar. Yeah, this is just a quirk of this particular room. This can potentially vary a lot more with your particular room. I just wanted to show you that the position of the sub does have an impact on the frequency response, and we want to find the one that is best for the particular room that you're in, and this starting with the center position. And in this particular room, if we were to actually turn this into a studio, then we'd be lucky because we could actually place the sub in the middle of the room and expect to have the most even response. So obviously we just optimized only for the frequency response. This whole time and in-phase aspect I didn't really show you guys here. We looked at the phase part of this in the last video, and the time part of this is really hard to show with the setup as it is here with kind of this standard 2.1 setup. As I mentioned in the last video, there's just so much going on in this room that I can't really reliably show that to you. But I think it's still worth checking this out, following up on this and seeing what it actually does in practice. Because obviously here I've got a ton of space. Yeah, I mean, there's no gear here, there's no screen here. I've just got my laptop on this desk, on this weird little glass desk. But in your studio, you might have a very big desk, maybe something very cumbersome that doesn't allow you to place the sub in a position that is on that imagined circle around your listening position. Yeah? You might be forced to move the sub further back, for example, or keep it closer than your actual speakers so that they aren't at the same distance to the listening position. Usually with most subs, at that point you're out of options because you don't have a way to adjust that distance offset between the speakers and the subs. But with HEDD speakers, we once again have that option in the form of this satellite distance switch. And basically what that does in practice is delay the signal either in the speakers or in the sub in order for you to once again bring them back in time. As I mentioned, I can't show you that here, but obviously we are at headquarters and we have a testing room at our disposal that basically eliminates most of the aspects of your typical room. So we can go in there, set up a little testing setup, and let me show you in practice what the satellite offset in the HEDD MK2 series does. Would you look at that? It's almost as if I spent the last half hour setting this up for you guys. No, but in all seriousness, here's what I've got. The microphone, the speaker, the sub, basically in the same setup as in the other room. So we've got about a meter between the microphone and the speaker and the sub, obviously, all in line. We've got them at roughly the same height as we do in the other room. So what we're just going to do is measure the response of the system in this configuration, but then we're going to simulate the sub not being in line with the speaker. So we're just going to move it back by about 1 meter, 3 feet to see what effect that has, both on the frequency response and the time response. And then we're going to compensate for that extra distance with the satellite offset on the back of the sub. Now, one difference that I decided to implement here in comparison to before is that I'm going to do this with the special linearizer, the phase compensation that's built into the sub and the speaker, with that switched on, because it's actually much easier to see what happens in the time response with the linearizer on than it is with the linearizer switched off, right? So yeah, you're going to see the response, the phase response basically being flat down to roughly, I think it is 80, 70, 80 hertz, something like that. That's the effect of the linearizer in order for the phase response of the system to be compensated. Yeah? And what you're going to see is just the difference of the movement of the sub, of it not being in time. You're going to see that much more easily in the phase response this way. So I'm going to be taking 3 measurements in total with the setup like this. Then I'm going to push the subwoofer back by 1 meter, and then I'm going to flip on the satellite distance compensation and take the 3rd measurement. Okay, so here's what we got. This is the first measurement that I took. So speaker and sub at the same distance to the microphone, basically no extra distance introduced. And so what we can see here is obviously phase response. We've got that linearized phase response, the frequency response analogous to that. What we can see here though, which is an effect of the microphone being above the floor, is the actual floor reflection comb filter being created. So we've got a dip here, we've got another one there. So that's an effect of the floor reflection to be expected. With that also comes a slight phase distortion. And so here's what happens though when I move the subwoofer back. I'm just going to smooth the phase response a tiny bit more. And here's the effect that moving the subwoofer back has. So we can see that there's a phase shift that gets introduced, a small sort of added time around here. And we can see the effect on the frequency response as well. Yeah? So there's cancellation that happens because of destructive interference, just like I showed you in the last video. It's not as strong though, because this effect is much more subtle. And then I switched on the satellite distance compensation, the satellite offset in the subwoofer. I basically just switched it to +1 meter, right? So an effect that moves the speaker back by 1 meter. And here's what you get at that point. So I did have to adjust the delay compensation slightly to account for the added delay of moving the satellite back by 1 meter. But once I did that, you can see here that the phase response basically returns to the state that we had with the sub right underneath the speaker. And we can also see in the frequency response that that destructive cancellation that we had before doesn't happen anymore, and it kind of returns to its flat neutral state. It's not exactly the same as before, because apparently the sub in its position right underneath the speaker does have an effect on the floor reflection, at least how it shows up here. But basically, this is the effect that you can expect with the satellite offset in the HEDD MK2 series. Okay, so back at the studio, and to wrap up this video, basically we just looked at how you want to position your sub, and that it really comes down to a few points. In a home studio, you want to optimize the position for the frequency response. That's kind of the highest priority. Second in line is that you want to get the speakers and sub in time and in phase, and in order to do that, you want to choose a position that is at the same distance to your listening position as your speakers are. And you can narrow that set of options down even further by starting with a position of the sub in the middle, in the center between your speakers, in order for you not to get any kind of localization mismatches, right? But that's about it. That's as far as you can really take it with subwoofers or with a single subwoofer in a home studio. I just showed you also that with the HEDD series, the HEDD MK2 series in particular, you can on top of that adjust for any distance mismatches by using the satellite offset. But all in all, that's really how you want to go about placing the subwoofer in your home studio. Now finally, just before I let you go, remember that I've got a brand new free workshop for you guys. This is the Phantom Speaker Test, how to set up your speakers correctly, no matter what room you're in, so that when you're setting up a new studio, in your home studio, in a spare bedroom, in your basement, in the attic, and maybe you've got some odd asymmetries in the room, you don't really know where to place your setup, where to get the best sound. This is the Phantom Speaker Test, my step-by-step procedure to help you find the best listening position in order to get a balanced low end, and then set up your speakers for a soundstage, a stereo image that sounds like you're listening on headphones. This is the Phantom Speaker Test that you can sign up for free at the link in the description. But with that, thanks for watching. This was a pretty extensive two-parter for me to make, but I hope it really showed you some aspects of subwoofer selection and placement that you didn't know before, that you couldn't get anywhere else. With that, let's keep learning to trust our ears and get back to having fun making music in the studio. I'll see you in the next video.